Welcome, everyone. You have reached the URU Town Hall, where we're featuring the Driving Toward Degree results. And we'll get started here when we give folks a chance to all enter into our town hall space. My name is Stephen Dandino, and I'm the Executive Director of the Association for Undergraduate Education at Research Universities, URU, formerly the Reinvention Collaborative. Changed our name this year, and people are getting the hang of it. URU is how we're shortening it, just emphasizing, dropping the A in association and emphasizing the other letters of our name. We're delighted you're able to join us today. We're expecting probably over 100 folks from around the country who are interested in academic advising as advising leaders, advisors themselves, or others who are focused on student success and want to learn more about this critically important field for all of research universities. Joined today by colleagues from the University of Pittsburgh who've been instrumental in helping URU delve into academic advising, better support and encourage the best practices in this area. So, like I said, we'll get started in a minute. We've got a lot to share with you today, and so we don't want to wait too long. We have someone joining us from Case Western, which is wonderful. We're so delighted. Welcome. We'll have URU members from, as I said, all over the country. Today's town hall will be recorded and posted to the URU website. What we do is we just take a little bit of time and make sure that we have good captioning for our town halls. So you'll see that posted in due time at uru.org. That's ueru.org. I think our numbers look pretty stable for participants. So I'm delighted to turn things over to Julia Spears, who's Associate Vice Provost for Academic Innovation at the University of Pittsburgh. And as I said, she and April Bellback, the Executive Director of Advising there at Pitt, have been terrifically helpful in providing leadership in the area of academic advising for all of us here at URU. So let me hand it over to Julia. Thanks so much, Julia.
Thanks, Steve. And we are so thrilled to have all of you join us today. We're thrilled that Cathy Shaw, who is a director from Tyton Partners, is joining us to share with you some of the latest results. There are 4 research briefs that she has really dug into what academic advising looks like around the country and some of the key challenges that we are facing. And I think you all will find that her information, the information that some of you probably participated in the survey, as you probably received that request earlier in the year. But I think that all of this information will help us do our jobs better. So without any further ado, Cathy, we're thrilled that you're here. We want to hear all about it. And to all of you, know that we made an executive decision to share broadly these research briefs. There is a lot of information on there, and we will share the links to all of the information as she continues with her presentation. So Cathy, take it away.
Thanks, Julia. Thank you, Steve. And thank you all the folks at URU that invited me to give this session today. I want to make it somewhat interactive, so fair warning, you're not just staring at the screen while hopefully you're enjoying your lunch. I will say that we have 2 quick polls planned just to make this not as static and not just kind of me talking at you all. So, you know, as I'm really happily seeing folks put in the chat, it's just helpful for me as a speaker to know, since all these sessions and town halls have to be virtual, it's just helpful for me to get a sense of who's here and see that folks are actually, you know, engaging with the materials. So we do ask that when we put the quick polls up that you go ahead and respond, because it just makes it more fun for everyone. And, you know, I'll spend a few minutes up front just framing. I know Julia said that we aim to be broad. But we did curate the content a fair bit to get it down to something that I think is a good flyby on kind of the topics covered in this annual survey funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And that Tyton Partners has been really, really lucky to steward over the last 5 years. And so, a little bit about how the survey comes together. We call the survey Driving Towards a Degree, and it's a research effort that is longitudinal, and we're 5 years and counting and running the survey. So it's unique in the sense that we're able to track trends, and every year we get to ask frontline advisors, other student support folks, administrators, folks that work in career counseling and financial aid, anyone who works towards student success and moving the needle there. And we get to help track trends in practices, in policies and technologies deployed, all with the goal of improving student success. I don't do this alone at Tyton Partners. I have a team at Tyton that supports me, and the alphabet soup of organizations and experts that you see up on the screen are all great collaborators and thought partners in the work that we do each year. We don't want the survey ever to get stale. So each year, while we preserve some questions to be able to track trends, we do seek input and updates. In particular, this last year with the pandemic, wanted to make sure we asked relevant questions with how folks were engaging with students throughout the course of the pandemic. And when, learning and teaching went online, so did student supports. And you'll see me concentrate a lot on kind of what we'll call the SIP practices and advising. As researched and studied by the Advising Success Network, we're going to be talking a lot about sustained, strategic, integrated, proactive, and personal advising practices and outreach tactics throughout this presentation. And so, just know that that's going to be a common theme as we run through the work. So enough about the survey. We start our first topic poll. So one of the questions we do ask year over year is, folks, hey, what are the top 3 barriers to improving advising at your institution? And so we're going to use the quick poll functionality. And if you could take a moment and just select up to 3 answers from the options provided. Hopefully we won't have to think too hard about it, but we'll give this 1 minute to kind of sit in the field, and then we'll just show you the results. And it'll be exciting to see whether or not the results from, let me see how many folks we have here now, from this group of 100, how closely it aligns with the group of a couple thousand that responded to the survey this year. So again, thank you for taking a moment to respond to this quick poll. I will let my colleague Mariah, when she feels like we've got a reasonable amount of responses, to switch it over and share what the results are. All right, so we've got, as everyone can see, caseloads being too high, budget driving some challenges. But it looks like our second one is lack of coordination. Let's see. Okay, those are our top 3. So in order, caseloads for advisors are too high, lack of coordination across departments or student support groups, and then the limited budget. So I'm going to record those, understanding, of course, faculty resistance, low student engagement, a lot of administrivia, and some lack of accountability for the outcomes are also some top ranking areas. So I'm going to close the quick poll, and we will compare whether or not our top 3 aligned with the 3 in this group. And you'll see one of the reasons we have cause for concern is that year over year, from 2017 through 2019, 2020, and 2021, the most recent fielding of the survey, what we do see is indeed some of these problems are perennial. You'll see that over time, caseloads for advisors being too high definitely has come up in the ranks. We do believe the problem of a limited budget, while not the #1 issue in the last 2 years, it definitely is an underlying area, right? If you can't hire more advisors, it could be because of limited budget. If you can't support better coordination and communication across departments, again, it could be because of limited budget. So these reasons for barriers of approving advising, they're not completely mutually exhaustive or collectively exclusive categories. I don't want to say that they are independent in any way, but I'm going to use the results of the quick poll and the results of the broader survey to kind of key in on some areas. Now, Julia mentioned at the introduction that Tyton Partners had created a series of research briefs. The topics covered in research briefs, which I will touch on today, are caseloads, our lack of coordination. We have a brief on student engagement as well, and a fourth brief on a topic that's important, but not necessarily called out here explicitly, and that's equity. And so the topics we'll spend time on today in order are caseload, coordination, and equity. And I will point you to the research brief on student engagement, just to pique your interest. And if you have any questions about any of the material presented today, myself at Tyton Partners, Steve, Julia, folks can definitely point you towards the resources, and I will share those at the very end, so you can have a link to the Drive to Degree research, as well as the Advising Success Network resources that support some of the practices that we're going to talk about today. So again, we're going to do a fly through on what our research said about caseload and how it impacts the policies and practices and technology, give you some non-technology related ways to perhaps wrestle with the caseload issue at your institutions, talk through the same sort of run on coordination challenges, talk about equity and what we were able to see and measure in our data around sentiments and equity and how it plays into creating student supports. And then if there's time at the end, we'd love to open it up for some questions. So that's the roadmap for today. And I'm going to go ahead and jump into talking about caseload once I share this slide. Just about the demographics of the survey respondents this year. And so knowing that this audience represents our 1 and our 2 institutions, you'll see yourselves here in this data, and thank you if you did go ahead and contribute this year or in prior years to the survey. We always learn a lot with every fielding. We have included data on 2-year schools here, as well as non-R1, R2s in the 4-year sector, but I think we do a great job covering a mix of administrative roles as well as frontline roles in the respondents, as well as good coverage on kind of the % of the student body at an institution that is Pell eligible. So that's my 2 cents on the demographics. And I do want to call out, we get a pretty robust set of respondents every year, a couple thousand. And again, we are grateful and honored that folks want to share their points of view and perspectives with us year over year. So here we go on to caseload. So caseload is identified as the #1 barrier to improving advising across many sectors here. And what you'll see, interestingly enough, it is much more acute a problem in the public sector, largely because of the volume of students that the large publics serve. So this is true in both 2-year and 4-year institutions. 2 years are the light gray bar, 4 years are the navy bar here. It's less acute a problem as reported by 4-year private institutions, but you'll see by far and away it is definitely the top barrier to improving advising at institutions across the board. And why does caseload matter? I'm going to spend a few slides kind of talking about why we see in our data that caseload matters. So one of the SIP principles, against that sustained, strategic, integrative, proactive, and personal, one of the SIP principles that we tracked in our survey was whether or not mandatory advising was practiced. Now, this is mandatory advising means many things to many institutions. It's not a uniform definition, right? At some institutions, it just requires an advisor to sign a piece of paperwork so a student can register, could take no time at all. At other institutions, it could mean a 30-minute conversation to talk about career goals, to make sure you've got the right major selected in order to pursue a career in a certain field. So our survey is silent on kind of the content of that mandatory advising session. We recognize it is different, but what you're seeing on this page is the response to the question, please assess the degree to which your institution implements this mandatory advising policy. And so we've defined mandatory advising to mean that students engage with an advisor at least one time per academic year. What you're seeing along the x-axis is the advising caseload. So we've cut it up in certain intervals. So you can see, for folks who have a smaller student to advisor caseload, that's going to be on the left. And then you get upwards to, a couple hundred, over 1,000 students per advisor, although admittedly there are very few schools in that final category. And what we'd like to call out is when we talk about mandatory advising, you can see the red line really draws your eye to the trend in this data. The dark blue shows folks, respondents who say they practice mandatory advising at scale, all the way up to the lightest shade of blue, which says it's just not implemented. And I think this data makes a lot of common sense, right? If you have very small caseloads per advisor, in the less than 50 category, you're going to have much better odds of being able to scale mandatory advising as a practice, as opposed to on the further right side of the screen, when you have a couple hundred students in an advisor's caseload, it becomes less and less likely that you're going to be able to scale in a meaningful way, and increasingly likely that you're not even going to try to implement the practice of mandatory advising. So this is one example of why we think caseload matters when thinking through setting up your student supports, because it can limit, caseload can limit which practices can be scaled at any given institution. Now, a counter piece of evidence in the data that we see is that sometimes there are SIP practices, such as proactive efforts to reach out to students when they appear to be struggling. Here, it's the same data mapped out the same way. Again, we asked folks to respond to the question, please assess the degree to which your institution implements proactive efforts to reach out to students when they appear to be struggling. And here's a situation where the red bar, again, to call your eye towards the trend, is across different caseload sizes, there doesn't seem to be, that strident pattern as there was on the prior slide, where, institutions who have very large caseloads and institutions who have smaller caseloads are all seemingly able to scale this practice of proactive efforts. And the reason we think this is possible is through the use of technology. Right? There are technology that allow you to send automated alerts, to flag for students, to flag for advisors when students don't show up for class, or when they haven't logged into certain learning management systems in a few days and things like that. So really, there are examples where caseload doesn't affect which SIP principles and practices you may want to roll out and scale at your institution. On the next slide here, I want to talk at a high level about something we saw in the data that was really, really quite interesting this year. So what we did was we ran a regression using the data from the survey and appending to it some data from iPads. And what we found was that when we looked at selectivity, enrollment, race, ethnicity, institutional operating expense per full-time student equivalent, and the percentage of the student body that is Pell eligible, and we hold all those things constant, we saw that reducing advisor caseload by 100 students showed a 1-point increase in retention rate for that institution. So this is done through regression analysis, and it was a statistically significant result. And so I wanted to say here that in the prior two slides, we showed why caseload was important in that it affected which practices and policies an institution could implement. And I would say if your outcome variable here is the 4-year, is the retention rate at a 4-year institution, it also affects that caseload is a statistically significant, factor in kind of influencing that outcome variable. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to lower their caseload by 100 students and then magically see that 1 point increase in retention rate. What we are saying here is that caseload and all these other factors held constant can influence which practices can be implemented at an institution. And then the push for more holistic advising, we need to be mindful of the complexities and interdependencies of the advisor role, the resources at their disposal, the practices they can enact, and also the other tools they have at their disposal. So I don't want folks to leave this session and feel this. And I do see a question. So thank you, Melissa, for your question. I will do my best to field in the moment. But the question from Melissa Irwin was, did the regression show any impact by gender when caseload was reduced? I'm going to say we did not cut our data for, by gender on the outcome variable, Melissa, if I'm interpreting your question correctly, which is, did the retention rate for women, change versus the retention rate for men when we drop caseload? That is not something we investigated, but it's definitely something that we will note down in potential things to explore for next year. I'm looking at some of the other questions. So the question from the anonymous person, which is, if you mentioned reducing caseload by 100 students, but from what level was the initial caseload? So this is a regression, right? So that means all the inputs here are included. So we needed, for inclusion in this regression analysis, we needed to have all the variables. So that's selectivity, enrollment, race, ethnicity, institutional operating expense, and percent of the student body that's eligible, and we needed an observation on caseload. And so for this, I think, many of our respondents had caseloads in the upwards of 100 students. And so I get that the nature of the question is that, oh, well, if I already have caseloads of less than 100 students, do these results matter to me? And the answer is directionally, still, if you were to lower your caseload, you would see the corresponding increase in retention rate, but it wouldn't be, at this increment. We chose a 100 student increment just to as an exemplar, but the trend is the same. The effect is the same, no matter what your initial caseload is. And I think I answered Tammy's question in my answer of the anonymous attendee. So again, love the engagement. Thank you for all of that. I'm going to keep pressing forward with the presentation. And again, the details behind the regression and kind of the nitty gritty, if you are curious about what the actual coefficients were on the regression and the betas, and then the alpha levels, that is all available in our research brief on caseload and how it affects student success. And the last slide in the caseload section here is talking about some of the technologies that might be deployed to support caseload management. And so what we see here is across a bunch of categories of different technologies, you'll note that caseload management, unsurprisingly, is at scale implemented, is adopted at scale across institutions at the furthest rate. 31% of institutions report adopting a caseload management solution at scale. And this is not surprising because caseload is the #1 challenge and barrier to improving advising. So it makes sense that folks would be adopting and trying to scale caseload management solutions to address this challenge. And so when we talk through coordination, we'll definitely talk about kind of the other categories that impact that, but wanted to highlight that some examples of products that work in caseload management are like Upswing and perhaps some of the EAB products out there. And we track and measure a bunch of different product categories here. And I think that I would point you to the broader research briefs to dig in detail. And the final question I'm going to field on caseload as I try to manage time is, again, from another anonymous attendee, what is the ideal advisor caseload? And so here I defer to my colleagues at NACADA and their research, which really says that there isn't an ideal advisor caseload because it's really dependent on the resources that an institution has to draw on, right? If you think about what I mentioned about defining that mandatory advising session, I think there's a broad range of, even within SIP practices, that a broad range of ways that institutions can adopt them so that it makes sense for them, right? And when you think about caseload, you have to think about the needs of the student. Are the needs of the student being met? And not just like demand for advisor time, right? It's not simply that. It's where do they say they need help? Do I need help with pointers to tutoring? Do I need help with pointers to the writing center? Or I need help understanding my financial aid, right? What is it that students are coming to advisors and asking them for? And do advisors have the capacity to have those conversations holistically or not, right? Depending on what's going on campus. And so it's not necessarily that there's an ideal number, but whether or not the amount of time an advisor has with a given student and students in their caseload, if that's enough to meet the student need. And I realize this is a somewhat soft answer to a very direct question, but that is what the research that NACADA and others who spend a ton of time here, academically speaking, have to say about that. So thank you very much for the question. And again, love the engagement. So the next section we're going to talk about is this coordination challenge. And by coordination, I'm talking about, can career planning work with the writing center, work with tutoring for academic, for student athletes, and how do we coordinate financial aid alongside academic advising? So the sense of coordination around all student supports. And so here, again, this lack of coordination across departments is a highly ranking barrier, and we see that in the data. But here, when we cut it by sector, we'll see that there's not that much differentiation across 2-year, 4-year public or 4-year private reporting of this challenge. It's in stack order, is number 3 when you collapse all the data, but there's not a lot of variance as there was with caseload in sector differences for the coordination challenge. I want to spend a minute about how we've defined coordination in our survey. In our survey, we asked a series of 3 questions that really kind of drove at defining coordination, and we created clusters in the data. So the 3 questions were, take a slider and move it around horizontally as to whether or not you believe the responsibility for student supports is unclear versus having clear lines of responsibilities over student supports. The second question was to ask folks to move that slider bar to say there was little to no communication between student supports. And then on the right-hand side, the option to select was there's strong communication channels between the student support stakeholders. And then the third element of defining coordination in our survey was that student supports are separated into different student experiences versus student supports are integrated and interconnected across the student experience. And so these slider questions indicate the level of collaboration across the student supports. So if folks selected the options on the right side of the screen, they were bucketed into a cluster of most collaborative. If they move the slider along to the left side of the screen, they're classified as least collaborative, and then there's a range that we'll call in the middle. And so holistic supports are meant to kind of improve the student's ability to achieve not only academic enrichment and progression, but also graduation and gainful employment, thinking that all student supports really move towards creating that better student experience and one that will set the student up for success. So what happened when we looked at this data and compared it to an outcome variable? This slide I'll have to take a minute to talk through. What we saw was that when we looked at 4-year institutions and disaggregated them by public and private to remove the noise caused by more selective institutions, some patterns emerge and are consistent across both public 4-year institutions and private 4-year institutions. So what we see here on the left-hand side is the clusters on the bottom. So you see the least collaborative, the intermediate group, and then the most collaborative schools. And then what we've done is tagged those schools as identified through the survey by those 3 slider questions into groups that you see called out on the x-axis. On the y-axis, you see the full-time retention rates, first-time full-time student retention rates for those clusters and how they changed over a period of time. And so the 2018-2019 data was the most recent in IPEDS before, and then we backed up 5 years from that. So what you're seeing here in the least collaborative gray bars is on the far left, is that the least collaborative institutions saw their retention rate drop over that period by -2.1%, and that the most collaborative institutions here in the brown saw an increase of 2.2% in their first-time full-time retention rates for that cluster. And what we're calling out is that there is a statistically significant at an alpha level of 0.05 difference in that change in retention rate between the clusters. We see that same trend when you look at four-year private institutions, but it's only somewhat statistically significant. The trend is the same, which is the most collaborative institutions had a statistically significant increase in retention rates when compared to the least collaborative groups. And again, this is why we care, evidence for why we would care about how collaborative institutions are, because it affects the changes in first-time full-time retention rates at four-year institutions. This slide talks about, the barriers for advising technology specifically. So not in improving advising writ large, but the top barriers for advising technology. The question asked was, what are the top 3 barriers for advising technology used at your institution? And again, we cut this data by sector. And what you'll see jump out is on the far left, the lack of integration across advising solutions and across advising technologies was called out, a lot by four-year public institutions, but also at two-year publics and four-year privates as being the top barrier for advising technology. A lot of these other things, we will talk about some of these other barriers in the equity section, but I will call out that the students not being engaged with technology is something that we do talk about a little bit more in the student engagement research, which again, we just didn't have time to share in depth today. But as we talk about it, I want to make sure that we see clearly that lack of integration across solutions is something that folks are calling out as a challenge. And I've just talked at you guys for a fair bit of time, so it's time for some engagement. We have another quick poll here. And the question I'd like you all to react to is, of the data you not currently have easy access to, which 3 items would make you more effective in your roles advising students? And Mariah, I just want to thank you. Make sure that that quick poll stays up for 30 seconds to a minute. And Mariah, again, I rely on you to let us know when we've got a good response rate from the group. And again, we'll see if the responses from the audience here today mirror what we saw as being requested from our survey, with a couple of thousand respondents. It's a fun little experiment. All right, let's take a look. Coming in on top is interim grades, right? Not just final grades. We've got that. Number 2 here looks like attendance history. And then coming in at number 3 are alerts. All right, let's see what our survey respondents said. We've got slightly different order, but the top 3 mentioned in the quick poll are also in the top 5 from the body of the survey. So the number 1 requested elements in the survey were attendance history, student contact history, interim grades, alerts, and then financial aid information. And these were the top 5, irrespective of sector. And you'll see that really when we think about the data elements that are here, they often are data elements that reside in either the learning management system or the customer relationship management system, or the CRM and the LMS. And these are the elements that were most frequently on the advisor's wish list. I would say interim grades, they do reside in the LMS. In some instances, they may reside in the student information system, but typically the student information system is reserved for final and only midterm grades and not the things in between. So while there are slight variations in preference ranking across the sectors, there's clear consensus across the 5 most useful data items. And when we think about this unavailable data, right, it's available but not accessible. I want to make that very clear. And we're starting to think about whether or not the systems that are used to engage with students, to advise them and provide student supports, if they talk to each other, we're really talking about an issue of integration. And so there are a couple of technological solutions out there related to integration solutions. Examples of this out in the field are things that are related to MuleSoft or Dextera. Those are some of those vendors that provide integration of data system expertise. And so what we see here, though, is that this category, while collaboration across student supports is a perennial problem, we don't see folks running to technology necessarily to kind of address the issue. And why might this be? With only 20% of institutions reporting adoption of integration solutions at scale, some of the reasons for this might be that the collaboration that can foster coordination, it can be cultivated through communication technologies such as Slack or Microsoft Teams or Basecamp or other tools like that. It can also be facilitated by usage of common file sharing programs, right? Whether that's Dropbox, Google Drive, or other things. And that facilitates and streamlines the sharing of information perhaps about students. And then I think beyond this, schools may be doing more informal practices. Hopefully folks are back to campus, things like organizing lunches that connect student supports to one another. So there's a space for all folks who work with students on the front line to share their stories, to talk about what they're hearing. And there's also, of course, those formalized communication channels and meetings across the student supports. So I think thinking through, what are the pieces that you can enact without, say, formal adoption of an expensive, perhaps, or something that's just maybe not even expensive, but just not a priority budget item for your institution. Just, I would encourage folks to think about the, non-formally integration solutions that are technology, but some of those communication aids that I spoke about, such as Slack and other chat bots that might be helpful here. I see a question in the QA about attendance. The research brief doesn't necessarily track this, and we don't address it directly, but it is something that we did hear in open-ended responses as being something that was a challenge. I myself was an adjunct in fall of 2020 at Georgia State University, and I know that tracking attendance actually was easier during the pandemic than it was when students were coming to Campus Live, because coming to Campus Live, the best you can do is to have a sign-in sheet, and then you have to have someone, enter it if you don't have a TA in the room, like figuring out who's there. At least during the pandemic, when we were teaching online completely, I was able to track data in the LMS about how often students logged in to their online learning platforms and how much time even they were spending in the solutions. So I think, while buy-in across the board is maybe some of that faculty resistance to change that we see as a barrier, I would say, pushing for integration from LMS, is one way to proxy for some of the attendance, because at the end of the day, you're looking to see whether or not students are engaging with the materials and kind of completing assignments and doing things like that. So I'm sorry, I don't have a great response here. So I'm going to move us along. I'm trying to manage time, and we're going to cover our next section, which is equity. And again, this wasn't, thinking through, one of those standout challenges that we saw in the quick poll or in the survey questions, but we know that for higher ed, access and equity are tantamount to student success. You need to make sure folks have the equal opportunity to achieve what they want to from their higher education experience. And so our instrument, the Driving Towards a Degree survey, I think is pretty unique in that it's attempting to measure sentiment towards the importance of equity in constructing student supports and driving towards equitable outcomes. But it also calls out a gap and a need in the market for all of us in the ecosystem to bridge a desire for more equitable outcomes to actual trackable equitable practices. And so I'll say that as the intro to this section, and then we'll just look at the data. So lots of data on this page, and I'll kind of walk everyone through it. So the question we asked in the survey here was a slider question where folks could say they agreed, they move the slider to the right, or disagreed, move it to the left, or felt neutral about a set of questions that were asked. So the question here was, do you agree or disagree that your institution prioritizes racial and socioeconomic equity in student supports across all levels and departments? And the unsegmented response is the bar on top, where you'll see, the 2,500 respondents, 45% said they agreed that their institution prioritized racial and socioeconomic equity, and then 14% said that they disagreed. What we saw when we looked at this data was that 41%, a near plurality, believe we're neutral. And this we're really, really dismayed at, to be honest. The fact that many folks feel neutral about whether or not their institution prioritizes racial and socioeconomic equity in student supports was really disheartening. We just don't feel that that's high enough. And I do want to call out here that we recognize that tracking equity is multidimensional. It's not as simple as cutting data by race or by socioeconomic status, and kind of our parallel to that in the higher ed world is the percentage of the student body that is Pell eligible, right? It's not as simple as that. But for the purposes of the survey, that's really what we focus on. We recognize it's the intersection of lived experiences between race, ethnicity, socioeconomics, religion, orientation, sexual orientation, gender. It's so many things. We can't do the complexity of the issue of equity justice. And so we have simplified in efforts to try to begin to understand some of the inequities and what might drive some of it. So I do want to acknowledge that we know we've simplified the issue of equity here on this slide and the ones that follow, but do know that it is in an effort to understand, a place to start to have a discussion. And so, as I said, what we saw when we saw this data was really, a little bit of a disappointment in that only 41% of institutions believed that it was a priority. And I saw a good question in the Q&A about sector, and I believe we cut the data this way and didn't see any strident results, but if you want to remind me of that question, I'm happy to investigate. I think it's a good one, and I just don't have the answer off the top of my head. So the next question we asked, again, another slider here, was agree or disagree. My institution understands the aspirations and experiences of students and uses that information to design and provide culturally responsive student supports. Here, we saw more folks agree than on the previous question. And in particular, students that serve, schools, excuse me, that served high percentages of Pell eligible student bodies were more likely to agree. And again, this was encouraging, as well as kind of a higher than average 55% versus 51% of folks who serve primarily students of color were agreeing with this. And so if we take whether or not an institution prioritizes equity and student supports to, okay, I'm going to use that information and parlay it into the design of culturally responsive student supports, this data is encouraging, and we would view it as something we hope to continue to see, and perhaps that more folks agree with this over time. And tracking sentiment here is tricky, right? Because it's not quite the same as tracking, brass tacks, are we all able to implement and adopt certain technologies? If we look at, again, percentage of the student body that is Pell eligible, and then whether or not an institution primarily serves students of color or primarily white students. And that's what the next few slides get into. This is a bit of an eye chart, lots of data on the page. And the punchline is that there's actually no reported difference in advising technology adoption and implementation when you're comparing institutions that are serving majority students of color versus majority white students. And so let me just take the performance measurement and management category of advising technologies. And example solutions here are technologies that take non-academic data and use it to try to flag for student risk. And examples are Ruffle and Olevitz or eLumen in this category. And so when we're looking at this category of technologies around performance measurement and management, and you're comparing the two bars in the segment, which are primarily students of color versus primarily white students, what you'll see is these institution types pretty equitably and equally are able to adopt technology and implement technology at scale. However, where you do see a bit more of a discrepancy across these two categories when we cut by percentage students of color versus percentage white, is that there are gaps in the red boxes where we call out in performance measurement and diagnostics of technology not being used at all. And so while those that do adopt and scale technology are doing so at even rates, we do see a bit more of a gap when we look at whether or not technology is being used or attempted to be adopted at all. So that part is the negative side of this story in this data. And then when we, again, cut the same data on adoption of advising product categories by Pell eligibility, and again, comparing the percentage of students that are not highly Pell eligible versus majority students are Pell eligible, you see that sort of closeness in the numbers here in the blue, where if you are choosing to adopt a technology here, there's not a difference in the ability to implement and deploy at scale or implement in progress. But there is a discrepancy when you're looking at whether or not the technology is attempted to be used at all. And so what does this mean, right? If you're seeing not a lot of gap between the lines of socioeconomic status and race on the adoption of technology by institutions and the student bodies they serve, where do we see evidence of inequity? We see it here. So again, this is a chart you've seen in the prior section, and it talks about the top barriers for advising technology at institutions. And this time, we've cut the data by percentage of the student body that is Pell eligible. So in the darkest color, blue, and the navy, you will see represents students that are institutions that are less than 20% of their student body are Pell eligible, all the way up to, in the gray bar, are institutions where over 60% of the student body is Pell eligible. And you see that there's a trend in the data for lack of integration across solutions, students not engaging with technology. And then the other two categories that I call out in these red dotted boxes, is truly, if your technology is not accessible to all, and again, the big differential between schools that serve highly Pell eligible student bodies and those that do not, 17% percentage point difference here is huge. It's significant, because if you don't have access to the technology, all the professional development and training for solutions, engagement, if you don't have access, you're not going to have engagement. And so here's where we start to see cause for concern and reasons for wanting to track equity and equitable rollout of any tools, solutions that are designed to engage with student supports and help students along the way. And sorry, one thing I want to call out here is not just about the technology, although, to some extent, it's easier to think about whether or not someone can have access to a tool and then be able to use it and engage with it, than it is to think about this, which is whether or not certain advising practices are rolled out equitably across different institutions. And here I'm calling out where you see the gaps. The largest gap is in the ability to roll out mandatory advising. If your student population is highly Pell eligible versus if not, and that 22 percentage point difference, again, is cause for concern, right? If you're an institution and you have the inability to engage students in a mandatory way, you could provide and offer all the services you want, but if students are not coming and are not engaging, and you're not tracking whether or not they're engaging with the services you offer, it'd be hard to see how you would change those services so that someone would engage with them, would want to seek their help, and kind of direct themselves towards success. And so, again, mandatory advising on this page is less likely to be scaled at institutions with high Pell eligible student populations. And even just saying that out loud, that should give us all pause. What could we all do in order to see these bars have less of a gap? So I have just talked to everybody through a bunch of areas. And again, I do want to call out, we do have a research brief on student engagement, which I didn't get to chat through today at a high level, but I do want to direct you all to those research briefs. And what we see is you can access them all at drive2degree.org. And anyone, if you email that email address on these pages, if you want to reach out to me, cshaw at tytonpartners.com, I'm happy to address questions one off. I also want to direct folks to the Advising Success Network. Again, this work isn't possible without their support and their thought partnership. And so these are the groups and the relevant links and sites through which you can engage with those resources. I'm going to take a breather. We've got a few minutes left and see if someone has collected any other questions that were in the chat. I wasn't able to monitor chat while I was talking, although I did do my best with the Q&A. April, I'm happy to see you.
Hi, Cathy. That was amazing. I think these three, ideas right now, caseload, coordination, and equity, I mean, they're on top of everybody's mind. As you can see, the questions that we had were awesome. So I appreciate those. I don't see any other questions from folks, but I'll put my teacher hat on and give everybody one more pause, 1 more minute. If anyone has any other questions, we're happy to take them, as we have just about 5 more minutes to the end. I see people saying great presentation. I really think so too. I think it was great. And I really appreciate this presentation today. It really highlighted some things that we're all just dealing with right now. And you've really brought out, and dug in deep the data and highlighted those things. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank the audience for asking questions, for responding to the quick poll. It's always a little bit risky doing a quick poll in the way we've just done, trying to see if the R1, R2 audience has, similar pain points and needs as the broader environment of higher education. But I did enjoy seeing those results come in and getting engagement. And really do encourage more of it. So folks, please don't be shy if you've got things. Steve.
I'm going to jump in. Can I ask Cathy, what's next for Tyton Partners? I know you're part of this advising success network that Gates Foundation funds, along with those great, institutions you have there on the screen. Are you planning, a next iteration of this survey next year, that sort of thing? How does it work for you guys?
Amazing. Thank you, Steve. So yes, we are planning to field a survey. I think we will start gearing up at the end of this calendar year. So in the November, December timeframe, we're going to start revisiting the survey. So thinking through the questions we've been asking, rewriting a few, adding a few. So again, if folks want to give me feedback on that, would love it, and invite that engagement. The survey will go to field probably in the early part of 2022. So I would invite you all to respond to it when and if you get the invites. Your views and perspectives, they all generate the insights that we're able to share out. So thank you, Mariah, for putting the link into the chat here. Really do want folks to engage. And I do see Caseload Management, Susan, thank you for asking the question. If you want to learn more about the caseload management, you go to drive2degree.org and download the Caseload Management Research Brief. Brief is a bit of a misnomer, or they're probably each 10 to 15 pages, chock full of data. And again, we invite engagement. If after you digest that, you want to learn more, we're happy to have conversations with any campuses that are individually, working through these challenges. We really do want folks to ask us questions, and that'll help us continue to think about the right issues. All right, everyone, thank you for your time. Thank you for the engagement, and good luck as we all work through another semester in a pandemic. Truly, good luck, and I hope to hear from everyone soon.
You bet. And on behalf of URU, I want to thank Cathy Shaw from Tyton Partners, Julia Spears, and April Belbach from the University of Pittsburgh, and of course, all of you who joined us today for your participation, great questions, and those who added links to resources in the chat. We really appreciate that as well. So this concludes our town hall. It's recorded and will be posted at ueru.org. That's ueru.org in about a week or so or more. Give us a chance to get those captions just right so that it's easy and accessible. Thanks again, everyone. And as Cathy said, have a great rest of your week.